One of the TV comedy programs repeated on television on different channels quite a lot is the old one, Dad's Army. Harking back to the years of the Second World War when the Home Guard were protecting the coasts of England with amateurs taken from the countryside and the local towns and villages. And in the story, which caricatures the Home Guard and has many funny incidents in it, there are quite a few characters, and each one has got a particular line. Young Pike, for example, a bit of a mummy's boy, is always saying, "I'll tell Mum." Godfrey, who has a weak bladder, is always asking, "Please, may I be excused?" And then, of course, probably the best-known character is the local butcher, who in the corps of the Home Guard is Corporal Jones. And when something unusual happens or sudden happens, he gets panicked. But he cries out, "Don't panic." But of course he always does and runs around like a headless chicken. But of course, we all do that, don't we? There are times when we all panic. I wonder, can you remember the first time you were taken to the swimming pool and taken to the edge of the pool by Dad or Mum and all that water, and you wanted to run back into the changing rooms or cling tightly onto Mum or Dad? And they took you down into the water gently, and still you clung on tighter. And gradually you would get used to the water and kick your legs, and were encouraged to then use one hand. And then you were held by the waist and you splashed around. But then perhaps suddenly the hands let go and you were on your own. You could feel yourself sinking. There was panic. I suppose we all remember that one. Or young people have got exams and there's a general panic before the exam time. I haven't covered all the revision I need to do. Or you go into the exam and you turn the paper and think, "Oh, I don't know the answer to that question. Will I get the grades for the course I want to do? Or for the job I would really like?" Or maybe there's a panic about a relationship, a personal relationship. A relationship going wrong that's difficult in the place of work and of business. These past few months have witnessed a lot of panic across the world because of the corona pandemic. In March, when the lockdown was announced, there was a race to the supermarkets and people cleared the shelves, coming out with great trolley loads of toilet rolls, of bottled water, and even of packets of vegetable seeds and flour to bake bread. They weren't going to be caught out, their cupboards wouldn't be bare. And so food had to be rationed. 2 or 3 packets of something at a time, in fairness to others. And then, of course, it was a difficult time for the workers in the National Health Service, cut off from home, exhausted, and afraid of catching the virus themselves, as some of them sadly did, and some even died from it, and we owe them so much. A difficult time for the elderly, who were often isolated, for people furloughed at home and not able to go out, managing children, young people trying to stay focused on schoolwork so as not to get too far behind. And now, just as we begin to loosen up, we get word of a surge in part of Leicester, which is being locked down again for a couple of weeks. And we have to go on living with the virus somehow in the days to come, so we're all still a bit nervous. If you go to the restaurant, will you be all right? Can you depend on others doing the right thing, washing their hands, keeping their distance, wearing a mask? Is it safe to go on the bus or the train? These are the questions we're still left with. Lots of problems and lots of anxiety still around. Now, King David, during his lifetime, had many anxieties. And we read a story there of what seems like panic when news comes to him of the rebellion of Absalom. And Psalm 3, in the first 2 verses, captures the strong note of anxiety. "O Lord, how many are my foes? How many rise up against me? Many are saying of me, God will not deliver him." The word "many" occurs there 4 times. How many are my foes? How many rise up against me? Many are saying of me. And there's a 4th "many," but in the more recent translations, it's kind of hidden. It's translated instead in verse 6, "I will not fear the tens of thousands." And the word originally meant myriad, many, many. Not just 10,000, but note, but tens of thousands. Now, David wasn't exaggerating. He's reflecting the truth of a situation that he faced, and we see it in the heading to the psalm. A psalm of David when he fled from his son Absalom. And 2 Samuel chapter 15 gives us the story, part of which we read together. So it's a psalm that's based in his experience that we can locate in a particular time of David's history and of Israel's history, when there was rebellion which led to civil war, difficult times and uncertain times. Absalom was one of the sons of David. David had several children by different wives. And in the past, Absalom's half-brother, Amnon, the crown prince, another son of David, had raped Absalom's sister Tamar. Now, Absalom expected, when news got to the king, their father, that he would punish Amnon. But David didn't. He overlooked it. He didn't do anything about it. And so Absalom, seething with anger and resentment, laid a trap for Amnon and killed him, and then fled from the presence of David. He was away from court for 2 years. It was 2 years before David allowed him back to court, and he knew that he was safe. But he was still seething with resentment. And under the pretext of being faithful to David, he began to conspire against his father. He began to curry favor with the citizens and many of the key people of Israel. And we read something of how he ingratiated himself with people and said, compared to King David, I would make a much better king. Oh, if I were judging all Israel, I would do justice and fairness. Everything would be good and everything would be right. The result was he weaned many loyal citizens of David away from him to his own standard. And under pretext of going to Hebron to worship God, he raised the standard and he declared himself king, and the start of the rebellion against King David. And when news reaches Jerusalem and David says to those around him, come, we must flee. You sense the panic? Or none of us will escape from Absalom. And here we get a glimpse into David's mind. Chapter 15 of 2 Samuel verse 30 tells us David wept, he covered his head, and he went barefoot. There's a sense of vulnerability, of anxiety, of the ground shaken beneath his feet. And it was one of his sons who did it. One of his sons whom he loved, a charismatic figure, Absalom. And he is stunned by this, as he is stunned by the strength of Absalom's following. And he learns the hearts of the people of Israel are with Absalom, not with him as king. And then disaster falls on disaster. Ahithophel, his trusted confidant and counselor, turns against him, switches sides, and goes over to the side of Absalom. And as David flees from Jerusalem in depression, a man called Shimei, who was one of the house of Saul and who resented the end of Saul and David taking over, comes to the side of the road and he curses David. He calls him a murderer, blames the blood of Saul on him, and hurls stones and dirt at him. Now, he would never have dared to do this while David was at the height of his authority and power. But now he does. It's humiliation for David. And finally, David tells us in 2 Samuel 15, verse 20, I do not know where I am going. He's lost his way. He's lost his direction. He just doesn't know what to do at this juncture in this difficult history. I wonder, can we detect guilt also and regret? Did he reflect on why Absalom did this? Did he begin to realize it's because he proved weak and failed to right a wrong, and it came back on him in this way? There's a conspiracy against him. And even the people speak against him and say, God's against you now. I suppose sometimes we all get into that position where things go wrong in life. Everything seems to be going well, and then all of a sudden it goes wrong. Things slip from us. Maybe relationships start to fall apart. Maybe business, work goes wrong. And maybe friends desert you, betray you. And everything seems to be collapsing. You've been let down. And people are speaking against you. There's rumors, there's mocking behind your back. Social media is buzzing against you. And people turn away. And you've lost your way. And you can't think. And maybe you begin even to start to think, as those enemies were saying of David, God has left him too. That's what they were saying. And it's very personal. You notice in the psalm here, the word me and my. My foes rise up against me. Many are saying of me. It's personal. And it tells us, and what David is saying is, it's got to me. His defenses are gone. Things that would have bounced off him and passed over his head, they've now penetrated and they've got deep into his soul and they're pulling him down. And those situations do. And maybe you've been there. So what do you do in that situation? The suggestion in the psalm is you take a break. Now, it's not obvious in the psalm as we have it written here, but in the older English verses, there's the word Selah, which appears 3 times. After verse 2, after verse 6, and at the end, after verse 8. It's not part of the original psalm of the writing. It seems to be a musical direction as the psalm was set to be sung and played. And it seems to say, rest, pause, be still, take a break. Let's just what's happened, what's gone through your mind, pause. Take a look at it. Settle yourself. Take a break. And then David goes on in verse 3, but you, O Lord, are a shield around me. There's a sudden change of mood. It suggests that David has indeed paused. And he's got a better perspective now. And instead of looking at the enemies and the problems all around him, instead of looking inwards and allowing what's in and the negativity within to pull him down, he's looking up. And he's looking up to God. The core of his being is spiritually reaching up to the spiritual source of all strength, God himself. The Bible in Genesis chapters 2 and 3 tells us that's how we are made. Not just material, but also spiritual. There's a spiritual dimension to our makeup. And it's described in this way, that God breathed into man the breath of life. And God made Adam and Eve in his image. There's that within us which draws us up to God, which connects with God, the spiritual. It's been interesting to note over these past few months reports that many more people are tuning into church services online, watching them, listening to them. And many more people have said they have been praying through this difficult time. They're being drawn upwards, their spirits, the core of their being, drawn upwards beyond themselves to God as their help. You, Lord, says David, are my shield. He's a shield, verse 3. He's the lifter up of his head in verse 3. He's the Lord who responds in verse 4. He answers. He's the Lord who sustains, verse 5. And verse 7, he's the Lord who delivers. A variety of strong descriptions as David is lifted higher and higher, and his confidence begins to return as he finds his confidence by focusing on God. He gets perspective, as we do, by dwelling in God and on God. He learned about God all through the years, through his own experiences and through the scripture stories which were passed to him. He knew the stories of the promises of God himself. I wonder, did David think of the promise of God to Abram after he rescued Lot from Sodom and Gomorrah and fought a few battles against other enemies? In Genesis chapter 15, verse 1, tells us that God speaks to Abraham, and God says, do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield your very great reward. Now, if David thought of that, then David would have thought of the events following afterwards, how through various dangers and also failures and faults, God rescued Abraham. He kept Abraham. He was his shield who kept him on the road. Even though his faith at times slipped and he doubted and took a wrong road, yet God was still his shield and brought him back and kept him on the path that was laid out for his blessing and the blessing of many in the years to come. Did David think of his own experiences, look back on his own long history of the many times that he had been in danger and God had rescued him, been his deliverer and his shield? Saul had sought several times to kill him, but God shielded him. When David looked for sanctuary with the townspeople of the town of Keilah, they betrayed him, but God delivered him from that betrayal. And when at one stage he was forced to go into Philistine territory, enemy territory, and pretend that he was mad so they would leave him alone and think he's no danger, God shielded him even there. His own experience, the promise of God, the experience of God's people, of God. These are the things which spoke to David and told him, he is your shield. And that's the story of the gospel. God comes to us, shield, deliverer, and sustainer in our need. Surrounded by anxieties and cares, we look upwards and find he is our strength. And he is so supremely in Jesus Christ, whom he gave to this world for us. We remember how the Pharisees mocked Jesus, troubled Jesus, were his enemies. We remember the Shemais of his day who threw insults at him, threatened to throw stones, and rejected him so that he was crucified on Calvary. Just as the hearts of the people turned against David, so the hearts of the people at the cross turned against Jesus. Just as Ahithophel betrayed his King David, so Judas betrayed his Lord Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. And Jesus was left alone, and he knew it. My God, why have you forsaken me? He took it all, and he took it to the grave, and he left it in the grave, and he rose again, conqueror over all. So just as David took it all to the Lord, so the gospel invites us to take it all to Jesus, victor and conqueror, that in his strength we may know his blessing. And there's another Selah. And after it, David says, I lie down and sleep. You see, he's come to that settle point. He's found himself again in the presence of Almighty God. God has answered him, and God has reached to him and hold him and lifted up his head. And now he can look and face tomorrow. He did it for David. He does it for all who turn to him. David celebrated his victory and the victories of his life, as he tells us in 2 Samuel chapter 22, a long hymn of praise in which he rehearses the story of his life. The Lord, he says, turns my darkness into light. I think of another man of God who was in prison because of his faith and because of his service of Christ, Paul the apostle, cut off from many, not able to travel as he loved to do, to spread the gospel and preach it, but tied down to one place with an uncertain future and perhaps facing death, which indeed he did some time later. And when he writes the letter to the Philippians, he's in prison. What does he say in chapter 3? I can do all things. How? I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Through Christ who strengthens me. He looked to Christ, away from his surroundings, away from his troubles, and he found his strength in him. I have been several times to the north coast of Antrim to Carrick-a-Reid rope bridge. And I've stood right on the edge of the bridge with others and looked across at that rocky island to which the other end of the bridge is attached. And I've looked down, way down, to see the sea swirling and crashing against the rock. And I've never crossed the bridge. I can't. I have a fear of heights. What I would really need is someone who has many years of experience on that bridge, going back and forth. Someone who would walk in front of me, in whom I could have confidence completely, and perhaps put my arms around their waist and follow them step by step to take me to the other side. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And the final Selah of the psalm, he pauses and he says, there it is. Think on those things and find your strength in him, the Lord, who is the shield who surrounds you. Let's sing his praise again. Very appropriately, in heavenly armor, we'll enter the land.